Good morning, everyone. So this is the second webinar in the context of three research seminars organized in preparation of the International Scientific Committee at HEC Liège. So at HEC Liège, we have our research subdivided into 7 main themes, and we also have 3 transversal platforms. One on digitalization. There was a webinar yesterday on this topic. Another one on entrepreneurship. There will be a specific seminar on financing entrepreneurship tomorrow. And today we are talking about sustainability. So I'm Professor Benjamin Huybrechts. I'm associate professor interested in social enterprise and sustainability. I will leave my colleague Nathalie Krutzen introduce herself just afterwards in the context of introducing our guest for today. Just let me share a number of information. So we'll be about 40 to 50 participants this morning in the first part of this seminar. So there's going to be the presentation of the research paper, and then we will have a discussion. You can already post your questions in the chat. If these are clarification questions, there will be the possibility of asking Professor Moon to respond. But otherwise, we will keep your questions for the discussion part after the seminar. So we ask everyone to keep the microphones muted, and I think that's it. So welcome to everyone. It's a great pleasure to organize this second webinar on the very important topic of sustainability, on which several researchers and several centers are working in the school. People in marketing, people working on smart cities, people working on social entrepreneurship, on supply chain, and many other topics. So I will now leave the floor to my colleague Nathalie Krutzen to introduce our guest for today.
So thank you, Benjamin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nathalie Krutzen. I am professor of sustainability strategy and performance management here at HEC Business School. And I am very pleased this morning to welcome our guests. I have here a very complete biography of Professor Moon, because he has been very active over the past 30 years. So I will try to summarize it. Professor Moon is currently Professor of Sustainability Governance and the Director of the Sustainability Center at the Copenhagen Business School. He is a political scientist who has been studying regulation and corporate social responsibility, CSR, for more than 30 years. His research focuses on theoretical and comparative aspects of corporate social responsibility and sustainability, and on relationships between government and CSR. Before being a professor at Copenhagen, he was professor and also the founding director of the International Center for Corporate Social Responsibility at the University of Nottingham. This was from 2002 to 2014, when he was also deputy dean, and I had the pleasure to visit him and his team by that time. He also has various visiting academic positions all over the world. So, for example, in Australia, in the UK, in US, in Italy. He has supervised 24 PhDs to completion. 22 of them were on corporate social responsibility and sustainability. And last but not least, Professor Moon has published in many of the leading journals in the management and business study field, such as Academy of Management Review, Business Ethics Quarterly, Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of Management Studies, Organization Studies, etc. So the list is very long. So I'm very honored now to let the floor to our guest this morning for his conference. So thank you, Jeremy, for being with us, and the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you to HEC for inviting me. Thank you to Benjamin, Nathalie, and Guadalupe for introducing me and making the pathway relatively smooth to be with you now. What I will try to do is share the screen. I think that looks like a screen shared. So again, once again, thanks. I would really like to have been with you. I like traveling, actually, which is a bit of a nuisance in these times. But for me, it's a nice way of meeting people and getting to understand their work. So we'll have to make do this way. The topic I've chosen is ridiculously broad, but I chose it for a couple of reasons. Number one, it reflects some of my long-term thinking on the subject. Number two, it reflects some of my current collaborations. And number three, I thought if it was relatively broad, it would increase the possibilities of engagement by you lot. So the focus is on, as you would expect, the roles of corporations in the governance of sustainability. But I want to think particularly about not just what the roles are, but what challenges arise from these. And I'll talk particularly about the roles of corporations in respect of public policy for sustainability and private authority for sustainability, and turn over with you some of the issues and I think research agendas that are arising. Just to put the thing in context, when I started my research nearer 40 years ago, I'm sorry to say, then things were rather different from now. And I think it's sometimes worth contextualizing that to appreciate just how fast moving and significant some of these changes are. So I started my research on these sorts of questions actually in the early to mid 1980s. And here, corporations were not transparent at all about their lobbying, at all. And they were rather diffident about their direct engagement in governance. They preferred to talk about business in the community. They talk about business philanthropy, but they were, even though they're manifestly powerful, they weren't keen on talking about it, articulating it. And I heard stories from people on the inside about Margaret Thatcher ringing the leaders of many British companies, asking them to do a little bit more, particularly in the sphere of education, how education is delivered and run in the United Kingdom. And they were very shy about this. They didn't think this was appropriate for whatever reasons. Now, and certainly over the last 20 years, we see great changes. Much more, corporations are much more keen to partner government, and not just at the local level, which actually they've done for a long time. They have become a bit more transparent about their lobbying. We maybe come back to that. And sometimes they've had to be. But they're also a little bit more upfront about what we might call policy advocacy, which isn't just claiming their own interests. We've seen corporations now creating partnerships with civil society, even multi-stakeholder initiatives, and these are what I'm calling private authority. They combine quite often corporations and civil society. And also we've got CEO activism on questions from immigration and human rights and sustainability in the broad. So a lot's changed, and a lot is changing, I think. And somehow I feel we need to sort of conceptualize and think about how these relationships are organized. So the questions that are relevant, I think, to this question, corporations in the governance of sustainability, are first of all, when they participate in sustainability governance, how do they reflect societal norms, expectations? How do they themselves organize themselves in relation to sustainability public policies? It's not actually easy. There's a lot of these policies coming from different directions, from different sorts of authority. What mechanisms do they use to influence sustainability public policies? Which ones are appropriate? Which ones are inappropriate? How do corporations create governance for sustainability? Who do they do it with? How do they enable other voices to be heard and be part of the discussion? And so, drawing these sorts of questions together in the broad, what are the effects and what are the impacts of these corporate roles, which still haven't quite been, if you like, grasped both by the participants and by academics. A few assumptions about the paper. Number one, I'm talking only about corporations based in democratically regulated capitalism, but I am concerned about their global operations. This is obviously narrow. Most of the world is not like this, but this is an important bit of the world for sustainability agendas. Secondly, I'm talking specifically about corporations. We'll see implications for other sorts of businesses, but I assume that corporations have rather different and higher public obligations than many other companies do. It obviously varies according to jurisdiction. Again, we can come back to that if you want to. And my assumptions about sustainability for the present are relatively broad. Brundtland plus Sen on effective human freedom plus human rights, which is a protection for humans. Again, we can come back to that if you want to. Before we move to the governance questions, obviously we just need to clear the air a little bit to think more generally about this sort of Janus-faced or two-faced relationship that corporations have to it, to sustainability. They're very clearly part of the problem. Manifestly, societies at large and governments themselves have very important agents for unsustainability, degradation of the environment, climate change, abuses of human beings. But corporations are pivotal agents as well. I think sometimes we're a bit keen to blame the corporations for everything. I'm not keen to do that, but nonetheless, they're clearly pivotal because they're in a sense at the forefront of energies on the part of consumers, producers, investors. These come together with corporations. And of course, because their scale and reach is so great, every action of a corporation has ripple effects. And collectively, these can lead to quite unimaginable thresholds and tipping points. And this, of course, explains some of the doubts about the suitability of corporations to take part in sustainability governance. And some people will be saying, hang on a minute, Jeremy, what are you talking about? Governance of sustainability should not be regulated by corporations. But conversely, they can be part of the solution. Manifestly, they're capable of, their scale and reach is capable of positive impacts. First of all, in terms of their own practices, which are clearly very important as demonstration effects apart from anything else, but also in terms of the supply chains and wider value chains. Corporations there is evidence that corporations are investing in, claiming, justifying, marketing, and producing goods and services which ostensibly meet sustainability criteria. So moving on then, so what are the motivations that are underlying these sort of twin effects, and particularly the interest in sustainability? Well, I think first of all, and those of you who've struggled with the Matter and Moon papers will see we would see legitimacy as very key. And we agree in this respect, at least, with Scheer and Palazzo, that corporations are struggling for legitimacy as much as they are for other more economic advantages. Because, and relatedly, of course, they're also trying to attract investors, employees, and customers who, I think, increasingly also are affected by social legitimacy considerations. We've got the rise of social responsible investment, ESGs, and so forth as an exemplar. But they're also, of course, motivated by the regulation to which they are sometimes party. But there is regulation which provides incentives, encouragement, and sometimes somewhat sharper standards and rules. But on the other hand, we have to see that they're also motivated by drives which make for more unsustainable behavior. Protecting sunk costs is a fairly obvious one. In some sectors, oil would be the most obvious one. Avoiding new risks. A lot of companies don't want to take risks. They don't want to be leaders. They prefer a safer game. And of course, these motivations, which might lead to less sustainable behaviors, are also often motivated by a desire to satisfy stakeholder expectations. You probably therefore detect that I don't see a stakeholder model as necessarily any more virtuous, ethical, or sustainable than any other. They can play both ways. So the balance of motivation for any one company obviously reflects very specific things about that company, which are very obviously fairly obvious, which markets they're in, what they're dependent on, their particular stakeholders, and so forth. But it also depends on the governance systems to which they're subject. What is the authority? What does the authority encourage and guide? What incentives does it provide? What organizational support and rules? These are the things which governments have traditionally done to encourage business, but not necessarily sustainable business. But again, in the last 20 years or so, I think we've seen governments trying to encourage this more sustainable business. And of course, we've seen the private authority trying to do the same thing. Which brings us back then to the question which we started with. So what's the corporate role in the creation of these governance systems, which could motivate corporations to more sustainable behavior? Well, I'm just going to start briefly with corporate social responsibility. I don't think it's the same thing as sustainability. They're obviously related. I see corporate social responsibility as a norm for business contributions to society. And of course, this norm over the last 50 years has caused there have been all sorts of different modes to address all sorts of different issues. But its core is a norm that businesses should take some responsibility for society. And I suggest therefore that this is a basis for a corporate contribution to sustainability problems. Sustainability seems to me to be a set of problems which are shared by the whole of humanity, and corporations can contribute. And CSR is a norm which might help us connect these two things. But the relationship of CSR to governance is more uncertain, problematic, and controversial. And this is something I'm writing about now with Yedestein-Knudsen. There are some who see that CSR and business initiatives should be dichotomous from government, both for the good of government, that government isn't corporatized, and for the good of the corporation and the CSR, that it isn't weighed down by government. But there are others, David Vogel and myself have also written about this, who would see that the interactions between CSR, corporate innovation, and governments is a positive thing. But of course, then there are questions about how CSR connects to some of the wider governance agendas, which are of concern to the critics of corporations and governance for sustainability. Lobbying, payment of taxes, complicity in corrupt behavior, which is legal in other countries, if you like. And there have been a number of perspectives from the literature to try to come to terms with these tensions and these roles. And I draw very loosely upon these. I wrote a book with Andy Crane and Dirk Matten on corporate citizenship, and we had quite a few papers that came out on this topic. So the idea of citizenship was a model that we thought was useful. I still do think it's useful. There's, of course, Sheeran Palazzo's Political CSR 1 and 2. This work on responsible lobbying and this new policy advocacy. With Andreas Rascher and Mette Morsing, we wrote about how corporations take governance, make governance, and break governance. And more broadly, of course, there are literatures which concern how we are governed in the broad. New governance was something that came out in the 1990s. The idea that governance now wasn't just governments, but it was other actors, including corporations. And secondly, the global governance, it wasn't just governments, and it's not just at the national level, it's at the global level. Clearly, these literatures help us position the role of corporations in sustainability governance. But I still think they're not clear enough, and they don't get to the heart of the matter. What does come out from these literatures is that corporations are clearly subject to the governance of sustainability. And that's been an important theme. And that's why people like Kofi Annan were keen to initiate new ways of governing corporations through initially this very weak but very big initiative, the Global Compact. But equally, it's why other governments, like the British or the French ones, have started introducing harder rules, expecting due diligence over supply chains, anti-corruption, and so forth. But of course, corporations could influence this governance. They can influence the very public policy which they're subject to. And equally, in the partnerships and the MSIs and the new standards, which corporations may espouse and apply, but they also are making these rules. Standing back, again, just for a moment, of course, business actually had quite prominent roles in human welfare, and including environmental welfare towards the end of the 19th century. This is almost a pre-corporate age, but there were still big companies, and they played a role in these matters. But with industrialization, the nation state, the welfare state, there was a decline in business roles, and they retreated more to this sort of private influence, the smoke-filled rooms, if you like. But of course, in the 1880s and 90s, corporations became re-empowered with all sorts of privatization agendas, and re-empowered again with international governance, with globalization from the 1990s and 2000s. But as I noted in a paper with Kurila et al. In Organization Studies quite recently, the states sort of come in again. And we see much more evidence of national governments now trying to not just facilitate and partner corporations, but also re-regulate them. So we have this sort of coexistence of CSR public policy and corporate discretion. And in the work I'm continuing with Yedestein Knudsen, we conclude on the basis of conceptual analysis and analysis of selected cases that CSR public policy can actually inform and stimulate corporate discretion. It isn't necessarily a story that CSR public policy constrains, holds back corporate discretion. On the contrary. Therefore, we concluded that corporate discretion and CSR public policy is not a binary thing. It's not that corporations have to go along with some public policy and they do their discretionary bit differently. But we see the two as related. And even new mandates which governments are bringing in for responsible business behavior do allow discretion into how corporations engage. How, for example, they comply with Danish reporting laws. But still there's discretion as to how they do that. You can come back and discuss that one again if you'd like. So, again, how do corporations contribute in the context of this re-regulation, where public policies are there's much more energy, if you like, from governments to produce public policies for sustainability? And how do corporations then manage these across multiple jurisdictions? This seems to be a research area which I at least have not seen very much in, but corporations are really in a difficult position with these public policies coming at them from all places. How are these managed inside corporations? And of course, I can't let this moment go without noting that national government ambition seems to be on the increase. And I don't think this is just a Trump and Brexit phenomenon. You can see this in India, Turkey, and other countries as well. So turning then from the public policy side to the private authority side, we've seen these new roles that corporations have taken, first of all, in clubs and associations with other businesses. But the key point nonetheless is that they've decided to act collectively, even if it's just business with business. This is quite a threshold change from, say, certainly the pre-1980s, when business associations were very much about trade, tariffs, subsidies, and the like, not about responsibility and sustainability issues. But then the corporations have started joining with organizations from other sectors and the multi-stakeholder initiatives. Some are principle-based, some bring standards. And they, of course, subject corporations. And it's interesting that in these context, these partnerships and MSIs, there's mutual governance where corporations govern each other very gently for the most part, but nonetheless they do. And of course, there is also an element of social regulation that's built into these by virtue of the role of the charities and the NGOs, which are the partners. The balance of power here is an issue that has been researched and warrants more research, I should think. But of course, it's these also that empower corporations further as governors of each other, but also of value chains and even other societies. I've seen this particularly in my work over the last few years in Bangladesh, looking at how Western companies have tried to re-regulate health and safety, for example, in the ready-made garment industry. Again, we might come back to that. And these, as you know, and our friends Mena and Palazzo have put very neatly, are very strong on input legitimacy. These partnerships and MSIs are flexible, consensual, developmental, deliberative. They enable buy-in, they allow learning, and they're great at these things. But there's unclear authority over the signatories. Most members of the UNGC, it turns out, leave simply because they can't be bothered to send in the letter to renew their signature, or for some reason they decide not to. And it's a huge turnover of membership of the United Nations Global Compact. And in a paper with Andreas Rascher, we detailed this in a paper in Regulation and Governance quite recently. And of course, there's very little, it's very rare that a member company gets expelled from these initiatives. I do know, having talked to the organisers of ethical trade initiatives, for example, that sometimes applications for membership are not accepted. And I do know in the UK, actually, it is a known case that the company Primark was twice suspended from the British Ethical Trading Initiative. Ironically, actually, it's a bit of a leader in some respects now, but there we are. And of course, very little impact on the corporate non-signed, corporations who don't sign. Well, so what impact does it have on them? So this brings us to the lack of output legitimacy, lack of effectiveness. So then the question is, how, or maybe should, private authority acquire greater authority over its own members, and even over to win over the recalcitrant, if you like. And this then brings us to the paper I'm working on, which should shortly come out in Regulation and Governance with Ben Cashaw, Yerestine Noosen, and Hamish van der Ven, where we look at these interactions of private authority and public policy. And again, others have done work here. We're trying to pull this literature together a little bit because we think this is where there needs to be more research focus. How do public policy and private authority relate to each other? Empirically, we find that they're clearly not separate entities. They do interact with each other, and I've found this in a range of policy areas. But in a sense, this interaction is not systematized, it's not understood in institutional terms, and it's not very transparent always, not very accountable always. And I tend to think that these things should be more transparent and accountable. But because very often, if the work I've been doing, say in corporate taxation or in ethical trade, you find there are public policy initiatives and there are private authority initiatives, and they rub up against each other in various ways. In what we call, for the purposes of this paper, governance spheres. So our feeling is the most important thing is that there's a sphere of governance, not so much that there's a public and that there's a private. So here's a brief definition of our governance spheres. They have actors, public and private. They administer and are subject to different modes of regulation. So they make rules and they're subject to rules. And these rules are directed towards issues and problems. And that's what we think defines a governance sphere. It has an actor population. It has a regulatory character or a regulatory mess sometimes. And it has a problem orientation. And again, those of you who know this literature will know that there are different typologies that have come out about these sorts of relationships. So some of them are musical, from Abbott and Sniddle, orchestration. Others are a little bit more functional in their description. We've come up with, for the purposes of our paper, try to simplify this a little bit and talk about three main interaction types that play out in governance spheres: the complementary, the competitive, and the coexistent. They each have subtypes, which I could come to in discussion. But we just want to, in a sense, make it clear and simple that in the governance spheres, there are these different actors who bring rules addressed to the same problems. And sometimes these activities and rules are complementary, competitive, and or coexistent. So finally, for the last few minutes, I just want to, having laid out the, if you like, the agenda and the concern, turn to some of the wider issues which I think feature in this, and again, hope that I connect with some of your research. First of all, with reference really to leadership, this phenomenon of CEO activism. Again, it's not wholly new, but there's a surge of it at the moment. And it's not just, I think, an anti-Trump thing, though there is some of that. And this CEO, because we find it in Europe, we find it in India, Malaysia, Bangladesh, wherever. It's a sort of personification of the corporation in politics, in the speaking and writing and endorsing and denouncing and threatening and organizing activities. And as I say, in some ways, this isn't new because corporations have been doing it, but it's this personification by leadership. What that actually means is still something of a moot point. Is it more about the leader? Is it more about a strategic decision on the part of the corporation? I'm not really sure. I'm working on this with Andy Crane and Dirk Matten at the moment. I'm not sure about that, but nonetheless, something's going on here for whatever reason. That they're playing a part, and it's very public and it's personal as well as corporate. So a number of questions here. I mean, can this activity advance sustainability agendas? And the literature to date suggests that for the most part, the CEO activism has been for social liberal causes, which I tend to think are generally, not always, generally consistent with sustainability agendas as I understand them. But what about the governance effects? What about our assumptions about democratic accountability and legitimacy, be it of public policy or of private authority, when these CEOs are coming in, striding onto the stage with the full weight of the corporation and the public relations armory behind them? Should, and more broadly then, do democracies institutionalize this corporate activism? At the moment, it's not institutionalized. Maybe it shouldn't be, but maybe we need to think a little bit about how it might be done. It's done in some ways, in some systems, I should say, but it's not very comprehensive. And what about from the point of view of the corporations? To what extent can they, and should they regulate corporate activism? Again, I don't know quite what is going on within corporations whose CEOs are suddenly on the headlines of the paper criticizing the president or the prime minister or the legitimate government. And the second main theme I just wanted to raise with you, and this is the theme of a call for a special issue, which should be published shortly in the journal Human Relations, with quite a long list of co-editors, so I'll spare you the long list. It would take a minute to read them out. But the point here is that these new sustainability governance systems, be it the longer reach of public policy, be it private authority innovations, they sort of enter spaces, particularly in the global south, of traditional institutions for taking responsibility: states, markets, corporations, families, religions, communities. How do these interact? What we know for certain is that well, at least I know for certain that the partnerships I've looked at and the MSIs I've looked at are very poor in addressing this phenomenon. Almost, it looks like malign neglect of interests from the global south being represented in these systems. So no wonder we might get contestation, resistance to some of this governance. So what how would this be reflected in the way corporations play out their roles? How is it experienced by those at the other end? And of course, we're particularly interested in this special issue in the significance of context, different places, different socioeconomic and political contexts. But I think this is an area which we're going to hear more of. We've heard quite a bit of it, I guess, from the sort of anti-corporate literature, and I don't number myself there, but I think nonetheless, there are some serious issues that need considering here. Briefly, I think very briefly, obviously, how do corporations then play out their governance roles at different levels? That's fairly obvious, really. I won't dwell on that for the moment. I think maybe that some of the impacts for markets are maybe more serious and may be worth dwelling on a little bit, because these corporations tend to be big players. Quite often they have oligarchic or even monopolistic market coverage. How will they abuse, or will they abuse, this governance power over, what gets licensed and the effects this have on protecting their own positions and raising competitors' costs? So sometimes you find that the most sustainable companies are actually rather good at consolidating their market advantages by developing private authority, which disadvantages their competitors. Just going down the list here. On this basis, how would corporate participants in governments be selected in order to represent a market better? Is that notion just bizarre? The idea that a market could be represented in some sort of equal or even or egalitarian way. Probably that's a bit far-fetched, but I hope at least you get the point that these players have market advantages which they can exploit as in the influence of public policy, obviously, but also private authority. What mechanisms might we have for accountability and countervailing power here? And then I've picked out some issues which I think in the paper, I just have a short paragraph on each. These may also be of interest to you, but I won't dwell on them anymore for now. Just to pull my thoughts together, corporations have long been part of governance, of course they have, in relation to formal institutions and more formally. But this has not been institutionalized or even articulated. There are concerns about legitimacy and effectiveness in these roles, and the challenge of sustainability puts these legitimacy and effective issues in very sharp relief indeed. Corporations are doing both things. They're perpetuating unsustainability practices, but also they have potential to moderate or reverse these effects. And they have the potential to have system-wide impacts for the good. Not many actors in this world have that. Corporations and CEOs are joining new authorities and engaging more expressly with public policy, what Matter and I would call explicitization, but also the standards and the norms which the private authorities are producing are becoming business as usual. They are having an effect in changing the regulatory environment, what Matter and I would call the implicitization. But this power, and in relation to public policy and private authority, in regard to sustainability, is poorly institutionalized. The positive effects may be exaggerated, and there may be uncertain effects on the functioning of markets and the smooth operation and just operation of supply chains and businesses beyond the corporate clubs. I think that's my lot. It is. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I think you can stop sharing the screen so we can see at least the co-organizers here. So we've got a set of questions, which I think will already drive part of the discussion. We have questions on the role of corporations in general, and then there are some questions on the governance issues and the different types of modalities you introduce in terms of collaboration with public authorities. A first question by Michelle. So I will read and maybe rephrase the question. So if those who've asked the questions I think it's not clear enough for one to add something. Please do so on the chat. A first question by Michel questions the capacity of corporations to address root causes of sustainability, of unsustainability, because quite often we see that corporations come with solutions, for example, recycling, green energy, etc., that may help to fix some of the things, but it's probably more difficult to work on some of the root causes that have made these problems happen. For example, overconsumption, where their corporations, if they act on these root causes, they might in some cases be acting against their own interests. So how do you see this possible discrepancy between working on solutions and working on problems?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And manifestly, as I thought, I've tried to emphasize that I don't see corporations as the solely to blame for the root causes. But nonetheless, I take your point, but I think they have more proximate power than other actors I can think of. To put it simply, the national governments, for the most part, are quite constrained. They do have power overseas, and clearly China is changing Africa. America's had a lot of power overseas, but it's hard to sort of institutionalize that power in a way that other actors can engage with. So I think national governments are constrained. International government organizations, again, high on legitimacy, very, very, very low on effectiveness, it seems to me. Corporations can connect. And I think this is the sort of point I would press. They can connect, let's say, and again, I'm interested in the moment in labour standards. So you can't say that a Western retailer in selling clothes is to blame for the work conditions in a Bangladesh factory. I don't believe you can say that full stop. What you can say is that two things, that they can seriously affect the working conditions in that factory in a way that President Trump, Prime Minister Johnson, and I'm not sure who the Belgian Prime Minister is, I'm sorry, can't do. They simply can't go there. I mean, in the Bangladesh case following the Rana Plaza disaster, governments, EU and American governments, and British and Swedish actually, and Danish, tried to sort of nudge a bit. But they it was very diplomatic, shall we say, except Obama introduced a threat that he would withdraw the license of the Bangladesh shrimp industry to access American markets if the Bangladesh government didn't do something. The shrimp industry accounts for 6% of the exports of Bangladesh at the most, compared to 75% of the clothing exports of Bangladesh. So look, even Obama, Trump are limited. These companies can connect with that factory. And at the end of the day, I hope it's always not this, they can say, we're simply not going to buy from you anymore. But we see a lot of models of collaboration to try and raise standards. It's a balance of collaboration and coercion, of course, and it's not easy, of course. But also they can affect the tastes of the people who drive all this, you and me. Corporations are really effective at influencing taste, habits. Now, there's the point about going against their own interest. Do they want to sell more T-shirts? Probably yes. Or could they get higher margin from a better quality T-shirt? Possibly yes. So these things obviously are in the detail, and that's important detail. But corporations are in this unusual position. Sorry, I've taken a long time to answer that question, but that I think is what I would come to.
Okay, thank you. I just want to mention, because you mentioned the Rana Plaza, Shoaib shared a reference on a paper in Organization about the Rana Plaza, and I think there are many others. Yeah. So thank you. We have two questions by Sibyl. I'm going to try to merge them. So there's that question of private authority, where you have private regulation schemes in which corporations are involved. For example, after the Rana Plaza disaster. But one common critique is that they lack democratic legitimacy, because rules are being emitted by set of actors who haven't been elected or democratically accountable. So how do you think that this can be addressed? And moving on to a second question, might collaboration with public policy, in the line of the paper you're working on collaboration between private governance and public policy, might this be one of the solutions? But I guess there may also be drawbacks in these types of collaborations. And so final part, is there any insights in your typology of interactions, of what types are most effective in terms of raising the bar of sustainability? So this is a bit broad, but I think these questions are interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, Sybil. Manifestly, there is a lack of democratic legitimacy, but I would say compared to much else in the world, there is at least some representativeness, which isn't just of the powerful. And if it is of the powerful, it's of a plurality of them. I think that the plurality is important, and I think the representation of other voices is important. And this is lacking, of course, in most governments of the world, and it's lacking in most international government organizations of the world. The United Nations, at the end of the day, is made up of states, most of whom are not democratic, some of whom are despotic and oppressive. So, give a little bit of credit that there's a representation and a plurality. And I think that's important. And of course, going to Bangladesh, the Bangladesh government is manifestly undemocratic, plays the rules, manipulates the rules. I fear the opposition would probably be as bad if it was in power. So the problems are this deep-seated. The initiatives in question, I mean, we've got a database now of about 100 since the Rana Plaza disaster. None of them would meet your expectations of democratic legitimacy. Absolutely none. Very few have trade union representation. Very few have representation of producer or other Bangladesh interests. It's not that they don't work with them, they do. So I think it's a sort of glass half full or glass half empty. I think there is something about the private authority which does bring this legitimacy which Mina and Palazzo pointed to, the input legitimacy. And it's not to be sniffed with. I mean, it's not to be sniffed at. It's something to treasure, but build on and polish, because the lack of Southern voices, and also my friend Kate Grosser did work on gender-oriented MSIs and partnerships, and she found a profound lack of women's involvement or involvement of women's organisations. So it's not just the Bangladesh story. I actually think that public policy can assist in a number of possible ways. Number one, actually, I found this the number of initiatives where governments have lent their support to private authority initiatives. Tony Blair actually launched a couple of them, and other ministers in other countries have done the same thing. And I think that they can do more than this. They can then give organizational support. And I think that this then brings a weightier expectations. So something like the the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative is now actually hosted by the Norwegian government, who I think are very strong on the importance of accountability in this organization. So I think that this is procedural accountability, not political accountability. It's more in accounting terms. But I think they've sort of stiffened the accounting credibility of this very important initiative, in my view, EITI. And in other cases, of course, it's not quite that public policy is a solution, but it's interesting that public policy has sometimes taken up private authority and taken it for itself and built it into its own regulations. So we've seen this in the United Kingdom with respect to some aspects of the Modern Slavery Act and previous act on modern slavery, which are slightly obscure name, so I won't bore you with it, where aspects of the Ethical Trading Initiative principles were built in. And indeed, that initiative was asked to help frame the Modern Slavery Act. in the American case, the Dodd-Frank stock exchange regulations, which were mainly in the light of the financial crisis, also drew on some of the extractive industry transparency initiative principles and built those into the stock exchange requirements, which of course been contested now by Mr. Trump and some of the American oil companies. I'm not quite sure where that one's going to go. So, yeah, and thank you for the question, because this is the sort of thing I'd like to see be more institutionalized, because these are just little stories I've got. They're true, and I think they're important ones, but they're not institutionalized in any way. They're not understood or appreciated as much as I think they could be. I don't know if that's helped with respect to the question. I've rambled on again a bit, so I'll stop and have another question.
Yeah, I suggest we move on because suddenly we have plenty of questions, which are all interesting. So it's hard to choose, but I guess at least two of them refer to power imbalance, because you mentioned the fact of having different voices around the table, but definitely we cannot speak of equal power balancing. So how to try to address this issue? Might public authorities have a role in strengthening the voice of those who economically have less power? And then what about counterpowers? Because all these private regulation and collaboration schemes may lead to having counterpower by social movements, by civil society, disappear or being co-opted. So how to address this issue?
Very good questions again. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the power imbalance is a tricky one. That's why I raised the somewhat stupid idea. Could you represent, just thinking of power in a market, let alone society, could you represent a market in some way in a private initiative so that those who weren't the big oligopolies weren't dominating? It is a bit of a stupid question, but it gets to your point. And of course, at the moment, the MSIs tend to be those who are willing and able to participate. And you can't sort of hold them, you can't stop them participating in a sense. A civil society organization can choose not to join a corporation, and a lot of NGOs and charities do choose to join. And of course, sometimes it's because they have dependencies of income from corporations, it must be said. Other times they're dependent on subscriptions, and that can help with the counter movement, and that some NGOs have incentives not to join corporations because their subscriptions might fall off. And I imagine Greenpeace would be a good case. It's a very well supported and very well resourced organization as far as I can tell. And its business model is rather different than, say, an Oxfam or Save the Children, which actually collaborate quite closely with the big corporations. How then, and of course, I think one of the points is how do corporations show self-restraint in these settings? And that's one thing which I'm quite keen on. I think corporations can do this. And we wrote about this in our citizenship book. But I think, and then you could say, well, and this is something that Kate Grosso wrote about in her work on her paper on gender, well, could corporations actually fund some of these women's organizations to play a fuller part, to attend the meetings, to have researchers and managers who prepare the representatives? And of course, this looks exactly like what you don't want. The corporations, paying, and of course, paying could require complicity. So could public policy help here was one, going back to also to Sybil's question. And I think this is something where the public policy could assist the relatively weak to participate in private authority institutions. And I think governments from the north and south could do this. And I'm just thinking aloud, and I've picked up sorry, who's this questioner? Whose question is this? You put two together.
It was Virginie and Sybil, those questions were.
Yeah, thank you, because you made me just think about this. That actually a government department could assist civil organizations to have the capacity to play a more equal role in terms of organization and resource in these private authority initiatives. So thank you for pushing me on that.
Okay.
Move on if you've got more questions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a set of questions. There's one I think that might be quite interesting, related to also internal power balance within corporations, and especially relationship with shareholders. So, what are your views on CEOs' leeway or managers' leeway when they want to implement sustainability policies, but might find resistance among their shareholders? What about the possible tactics there, and maybe what you've observed in your own research?
Yeah, I tend to think this problem is rather exaggerated. I've not seen a lot of capital flight from companies which are interested in adopting responsible and sustainable business models. You may come up with some examples to prove me wrong. And of course, as Lynn Stout has demonstrated in the American case, the corporate governance systems aren't quite that simple. That the agent principal relationship here is, a bit of misunderstanding. And again, this is certainly true in the United Kingdom, as John Parkinson demonstrated in the 1990s. And then you come to the rest of the world, leave the Anglo-American side, and I know Scandinavia now better than I'm afraid I know Belgium. But the assumptions in corporate governance about purpose, company purpose, control, and ownership are mercifully more, in a sense, more, well, let's say, not so adversarial as between the textbook agent principle image, which what's his name, Jensen and his co-author offered us. Now, I'm not saying that shareholders therefore will sanction philanthropy gone mad, which was Friedman's great concern. They're interested in a case for a long-run approach, and some corporate governance models really advantage a long-run approach. Certainly in Scandinavia, they do. They're interested in a business case sometimes. How does the company save money by adopting an environmental initiative? But what's certainly true is there seems to be, it's not just corporations saying that investors are wanting more responsible, sustainable approaches, but it's the investment, the financial world itself is saying this. And that this idea of ESG has become a bit of a mantra in the financial world now. Interesting, at CBS, we've been invited, our department's been invited to help the financial sector understand ESG and how it can be advantaged. So I don't find that so much, that bit at least, so much of a problem. I think as I mentioned in my somewhat a bit of an aside with this CEO activism, how that's governed, I'd be really interested to know more about, and I haven't done any research or read any papers on it yet. So, and clearly at the end of the day, and now we have the COVID crisis, we have companies being criticized for pulling out of orders in Bangladesh. What do? Some companies, of course, are sacking their workers in the retail outlets. Others are stopping paying rent on properties in high streets. So there's three stakeholders that in this COVID crisis, corporations have got to balance: employees, business customers, and supply chain companies and workers. So I think these are important matters. How companies are dealing with them, I don't know. I've got a little project on 4 companies. I can't tell you the answer for those companies yet. So I think I think the principal agent thing is a bit over-egged. I think there are very important governance questions reflecting different interests in sustainability, and the COVID thing brings these to the fore. So again, a good question. I don't really have a clear answer.
Yeah, just by the way, really, I advise you to read the details of the paper and the different papers that are being referred to, because I guess if you put all these papers together, you have quite a lot of empirical evidence that can support the different points.
Yeah.
There's a bit of skepticism in relation to corporations' self-governance or self-restraining in terms of unsustainable behaviors. So there's a question raised by Shoab and others, and I also was curious to hear more when during your speech, you mentioned these different federations, business clubs, and initiatives where different corporations come together. Do you think that this mutual control can really be effective? And if not, I mean, yeah, who can govern corporations beyond corporations themselves?
Thank you. Again, hard questions and good ones. I suppose it's quite, you know, if we were doing an experiment, it'd be quite hard to identify a case of self-restraint, because the corporation would probably present it in some other terms. It would be a strategic decision, a wise decision, a better investment. Corporations aren't very good at being self-restrained. However, I've looked at companies, when I started all this research in the depression, well, not depression, what was it called? Recession in the early 1980s in Britain, right? Phenomenal unemployment, hyperinflation. It was a terrible time. And a number of companies were slowing down, closing down. And I could compare companies and the way they exited. And some exited with some grace and some concern with those on whose lives their decisions fell most seriously, and others didn't. I won't go into the details of it, but I think there are companies are capable of understanding that their impacts make a difference, and they can make decisions about this. And this will reflect company history, purpose, leadership, all sorts of considerations, of course. So I don't think this is impossible. And I think our job is to create the conditions where companies are aware that they're being judged on these sorts of decisions. And maybe that's how things like investment indexes and consumer labels could be better focused to make this clear. The associations and clubs, well, at the end of the day, it's the clubs of the powerful. But I think that they've done I think they've had one achievement, that the corporations realized that they needed to understand together that there is society impatience and dissatisfaction with their impacts, but they weren't sure what to do. And I think, so at least the one thing that the clubs have enabled is an agreement that, well, this is possible. A small move may be possible, to have some principles, which of course have the effect that they're judged by them in the court of public opinion. So these are very weak regulatory mechanisms, but they are regulatory mechanisms. Corporations don't like being embarrassed and being told that they said one thing one year and now they're doing this. So I'm not saying this is changing the world, but I do think these are positive moves. Who can govern them beyond? Well, nobody can, full stop. And that's the truth of the matter. Corporations can move home very easily. Now that might change. This autarky I mentioned may make it harder for companies to be quite so mobile as they have been. And Mr. Trump certainly was trying to make it harder for companies to be promiscuous with their investments, to invest in Mexico, not America. So it's not beyond the ambition of national governments, but at the end of the day, I think it's forlorn on their part. And that's why the encouragement of these blended governance models, I think, is where we should be focusing our attention. Is it due to the capitalist system we are embedded in? We're sort of not. I'm not sure what that is, to be honest. We seems to be we're embedded in lots of systems. Capital's very powerful, but you know, China and India are major powers. In Scandinavia, capital is constrained in different ways. So I don't think there is I don't buy into the sort of global capitalism systems explaining everything. I think it's messier than that. But I know what you mean. There are rules and there are factors of production and there are markets, and they play out in certain ways which sometimes don't help. But who's going to start closing down markets and on what grounds? And I think markets clearly need regulating for human reasons and environmental reasons. No one government is in a position to do this on the global scale. You know that as well as I do, of course. Sorry if I'm saying the obvious.
Okay, I'll leave the floor to Natalie for a final question.
You're not. Yeah.
Sorry, I had a question. Maybe I have a lot of questions, but I had one question. I have to find it in the chat because I wrote it. Yes. So, as it is about governance models, about including many stakeholders, my feeling, and it's a more concrete fact, is that the problem is that different actors, so public actors versus private actors, companies, SMEs, etc., have different languages. They have different timing, different pressures, different interests. And when you try to make them interact and to align towards a goal, at the end you lose the major expected positive impacts you want on the society. And so would you have best practices or examples of how to favor positive interactions between actors to overcome all these challenges? Because I have the feeling that this is one of the key points for improving the governance for sustainability, to find arenas, not too broad, not too small, where they can get to know each other better and find a real alignment between their interests that won't lose all its substance. I don't know if my question is, do you have in mind a successful experience or a successful arena where this positive interaction was possible?
Well, I'm always aware of our imperfection, and I'm not a great one for case studies with my teaching, actually, and I don't, because I think any company that does something good, probably you can find something in the back cupboard, much like you and me, that, you know, we're not quite as, or at least I'm not quite as angelic as I might look, in as much as I look angelic. But so I tend to think that it's more about creating opportunities for interaction between the languages, the timing, the interests that you correctly articulate, and recognizing them. And I think that's why the special issue, which I talked about in human relations, is trying to really get at that, rather than just criticize the corporations, but understand that these interactions need to be understood for effective solutions. Can I give examples? Well, and actually, if we went back to our Bangladesh study and looked at the two most famous and the two most criticized, or certainly one most criticized of the initiatives, and the American-based Alliance and the mainly European Accord, both of them have remediated factories at quite a high rate. It's been slow. It's because auditors have been required, but the factories have been remediated by reference to the health and safety standard to which they're committed. Have labour rights been transformed in Bangladesh by their work? No, that wasn't their intention. And there's been unfortunate, a lot of these initiatives have been criticised for things they weren't trying to do. They were trying to address occupational health and safety because a building collapsed and killed 1,000+ people. And so several thousand factories now operate in a way that the workers can have a little bit more confidence in their safety. Now, building on that, scaling up, and that's what other initiatives are now doing. But again, they're operating on a piecemeal basis. So there's one initiative we're looking at which has a helpline, very much a reactive model, maybe not very impressive in some ways, but it's a helpline. So if a worker thinks that something's dangerous, they can make a phone call. And then there are other initiatives which carry this work, which try to build in better union representation, rather than just the individual work using the helpline. And there are yet others which have tried to focus on management training and better auditing. So there are a number of initiatives. None of them are going alone will give you that nice story about the Bangladesh supply chain, but it's a piecemeal thing. And they, as I say, they're interactive. And actually, there are some Bangladesh government-led initiatives which are part of this mosaic. More broadly, I've got colleagues who are interested in, I mean, I've got one initiative, ironically, from Ethiopia, which is at war at the moment, of initiatives and standards which will be led by Southern NGOs, or at least in which Southern NGOs play a key part. A colleague in India, Bimal Arora, has been looking at basically Southern producer standards for cotton and cotton products, which have been picked up by the retailers like Marks and Spencer's in England. Again, it's having that conversation between the languages, the different interests, giving those space. It's not making the world a better place overall, but it's making the lives of bunches of people safer, more secure. I haven't talked much about the environmental challenges, and maybe this was a weakness and we should have spent more time there, because they do require wholesale solutions rather than just the addition of small bits to improve the lives of workers. So I apologize that our time has gone on. I should have really spent more time on that. I'm sorry.
No worries. Definitely we cannot finish the whole discussion on these different themes in 1 hour and 15 minutes. So we have to stop now, but we are meeting in 15 minutes time for those interested in addressing more the research side of sustainability. So different questions related to how to do research in the best possible ways, whether you are doctoral student or more experienced scholar. There are 2 or 3 questions that we were unable to address. I'm sorry, but I guess it might be possible to embark them into the second session. For example, one by Giovanni, who questions the blurring lines between management and politics. And so that's maybe a question for a discipline, maybe governance as a bridge between management and politics. And then we also had a question by Neamat about exogenous shocks and crises, such as COVID, which might be an opportunity, well, for further actions on sustainability, but also for particularly relevant research. So please keep these questions in mind. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. Thank you, Jeremy, for this great presentation.
Right. Lovely questions. Thank you very much.